We practiced this last night just to be sure we could get it. There we go. Share, and we'll go full screen. All right, so if possible, could someone let me know that you guys can hear me and see my title slide?
Yes.
Perfect, thank you so much. So my name's Chris Leeth. I am an assistant professor in practice at the University of Texas at San Antonio and a licensed professional counselor and supervisor. And I'm presenting with Carl Price, and I'm gonna let Carl introduce himself, but he is one of our fantastic master level graduate students.
I appreciate that, Dr. Leeth. As Dr. Leeth mentioned, I am a master's student in the clinical mental health program at the University of Texas, San Antonio. And I was drawn to this particular topic because of my own background with healthy living, lifestyle patterns. My bachelor's in kinesiology, exercise science. I also have a history of being a certified trainer, licensed massage therapist, things of that nature. And I know that from my own experience, I had a lot of prejudice and some stigmatized belief that are experiencing this disorder and other similar eating disorders, as well as obesity and lifestyles.
And I am just enamored with eating, both personally and working with the eating disorders. I like the eating disorders, the binge eating disorder, especially body image things. Everybody has to eat, and everybody experiences emotions and thoughts and things like that. And so this is just a really fascinating set of behaviors and patterns and things like that. And so we're gonna try our best to keep it to the 55-minute time limit. If you all have questions, let us know. And so let's kind of go into what we're going to cover. Go over a very quick history of binge eating disorder and how is it different from overeating and emotional eating. The criteria that's listed in the DSM-5, what binge eating disorder isn't, the associated features, the development of it, how to assess for it and diagnose if needed, and treatment for it. So let's kind of move forward here. With the history, it is the most prevalent of the eating disorders. Prior to DSM-5, it was diagnosed as EDNOS. The eating disorder is not otherwise specified. It wasn't a diagnosable disorder in DSM-4 TR. Twice as likely to occur in women, but this is debated because there are huge differences in counseling rates between men and women. So that's a statistic I would take with a grain of salt, that it may actually occur at equal rates, if not more, in men, but it goes undiagnosed because men seek counseling less often. We see an early onset in the late teens, early 20s, and so far, no difference in prevalence between ethnicity or sexual orientation. The first notable recognition of this set of behaviors was in the 1950s. And I always thought this was kind of a fun fact if you're ever at like a trivia night. The first person to write about binge eating was a guy named William Hamburger. And he described it as an insatiable appetite, like an incredible need to eat. From there, it evolved into this concept of emotional eating, which chances are, if you're practicing, you have worked with a client who has emotional eating. That's something that's very common. I think we can all relate to that. In DSM-3, we were able to diagnose binge eating. For bulimia, originally, the purging symptom or the purging criterion was optional. So if there was binge eating alone, one could diagnose as bulimia. However, in 3R, we then relabeled it as bulimia nervosa. We started requiring that the person had a purging behavior, and that left the binge eating by itself, just the set of eating without purging by itself, undiagnosable except for EDNOS. Carl, did you want to take us through the criteria?
Yes, sir. And just describing how the DSM-5 has separated this now from the other eating disorders, namely bulimia nervosa. DSM-5 describes it as having recurrent episodes of binge eating in a discrete period of time. Dr. Leeth will discuss later on, though, don't get so caught up on that time block. Okay, so here they have less than 2 hours, eating what is considered an amount of food that is larger than what others would eat in a similar circumstance. And overall, this individual experiencing a disassociation, a lack of control while eating during the binge episodes. And then, of course, having at least 3 of the following symptoms, that is, eating much more rapidly than what is considered normal, eating uncomfortable amounts of food. As one interviewee described it, it was akin to eating the amount of food that one would eat on Thanksgiving, being uncomfortably full times 100. And some of those individuals do experience eating large amount of foods when not hungry, attributing to that feeling of discomfort. And because they're eating so much at one time, a lot of them find themselves eating in a situation where they are separated from others due to embarrassment, and finding that after that binge eating episode, they're left with feelings of depression and guilt, and overall being disgusted. The DSM further describes the severity levels of this based on the frequency of those binge eating episodes. So at least having 1 binge eating episode per week for at least 3 months. So as Dr. Leeth has described some of that history and where we are now with the DSM-5 and the current criteria, does anyone have any thoughts, any questions about the information we just covered? Hannah, thank you for sharing that. I understand that it's not easy talking about our personal experiences, especially given that we're in such an aesthetic obsessed society, and one that harps on competition against others at the individual level. So again, Hannah, we do appreciate you sharing your personal experiences.
For the question, Cody, that you asked with the quarantine and the shelters in place, I imagine that the people with binge eating disorder would probably, the symptoms would probably amp up, whether it be from the anxiety of COVID-19, the fear of catching it, to dealing with loved ones. If someone was laid off, they're not able to go to work, they're at a place where their place of work is not helping. Elizabeth, absolutely. The boredom, right? The discomfort, some unresolved feelings, things like that. Absolutely. I think this could exacerbate those symptoms. Oh, there we go. So definitely large amounts of food. That is one. Trying to move this text box just out of the way here. Definitely large amounts of food, right? That's how the DSM describes it. There is no set amount of food, right? There's not a magic threshold where if you eat past this amount, then it's a definitely a large amount of food. This is something you work with your client. Is that a lot for you? Is that a lot compared to your family meals, things like that you grew up eating? It's something that you work with. But again, the big thing, like Carl said, is if they're feeling uncomfortably full, and this is happening often, And we would expect that uncomfortably full to be quite a bit. We can all relate to being uncomfortably full. It's when it's often, and it's to the point where the person's feeling really, really sick or they're hurting. Some studies have tried to measure this. It's been very difficult to measure this using diaries. Part of that is notoriously what happens is people in general, including myself, when we're asked to record how much we eat, we tend to either over or underestimate. There have been some really interesting studies about somebody writes down on their diary what they ate, they look at it, and then they kind of edit it out of that sense of shame and guilt, or I don't want someone to see this, so I kind of change what I'm reporting. And that just goes to show that eating behavior and food, it has a lot of, there's a lot of pressure, and there can be stigma about how we eat, the amount we eat, and what we eat. There have been some studies that have tried to control eating, so in a lab setting. One study that I thought was really interesting was they let participants eat as much as they wanted of one type of food, and that type of food was yogurt. And it's just, you know, how much yogurt can one person eat? However, this study, it ends with comparing what is a non-clinical amount of food compared to bulimia, what happens in a binge with bulimia, and what happens during binge eating disorder. And so what we see is, on average, a meal, and again, this is, Carl can probably say more than I can about it with his background, you know, per meal in a non-clinical population is about 500 calories per meal, plus or minus. In a binge episode for bulimia, the number of calories ranges between about 1,200 and 2,800. In a binge episode for someone with binge eating disorder, it goes up to and is around about 5,000 calories. And so that person is eating that much multiple times a week. What we're seeing now is that happens multiple times a day, having that much. And a question that I often get is, what does 5,000 calories look like? Well, that would be 5 like double quarter pounders from McDonald's. It would be 3 medium pizzas. If you have a Freebirds, I know this just because last night I had Freebirds for dinner, it would be 3 to 4 monster burritos. So it's quite a bit of food. And one thing that is notable is that people with binge eating disorder, they're eating the really calorie dense foods. And this isn't a nutrition discussion or anything, but it's cravings for sweet, salty, fatty, processed foods, right? So it's stuff that you're driving through, you're picking up. It's really easy to get. Fast food joints are a dime a dozen. So it's easy to get all of that food. And now we see with a lot of these chain restaurants, the 4 for $5 meals, or you're getting several items. So it sounds like a lot, and it can be a lot, especially when you're doing this multiple times a day, if not multiple times a week. There's some differences between what large means and how it manifests between sexes, right? And so how we define large. So for example, when I go out to dinner with my wife, the amount that she orders versus the amount I order, what's typical for me is very large for her, and what she typically orders, I look at it and say that would not be enough for me. And so when they look at studies between sexes, we see that what women consider large in terms of food is very different from what men consider. So again, this just goes to the point that when you're working with someone with food, and is it a lot, is that this has to be a very tailored question, right? And we're asking them about what did they think is a large amount of food? What is typical for you? What did you grow up? As opposed to prescribing to them saying, that's a lot of food, right? The discrete time criterion, this is where I think a lot of people get stuck. And it's something that I'm hoping will get revised in the 5R edition of the DSM. I suspect they're going to edit this. So it does say that the person has their binge in a discrete amount of time. So they give the example of less than 2 hours. This is not what always happens. It definitely can. However, there is a lot of literature that suggests that people with binge eating and people without it as well, because of stigma and pressure around what I'm eating, I don't want people to look at me and say, you're going to eat all that or you're hungry again. I might alter my eating patterns, right? I might graze on on moderate amounts of food throughout the day. I might not always just have this single binge episode. I might stretch it out throughout my day. So I could go to a birthday party and I have the slice of pizza and I have the ice cream and I have the cake. And then I don't want people to see me eat more than that. So I'll wait. And then I will, on my way home, drive through somewhere. I'll stop and pick something up. And then eat privately. So there are plenty of examples that it's not going to just happen in 1 2-hour window. It might be stretched out throughout the day.
And you know, speaking to that, and I just saw one of the questions and some of the comments. So just to specify on those criteria, some of those negative feature criterion, again, these individuals are eating much more rapidly than what would be considered normal. So I saw some of the comments in the comment block about people now being quarantined and they're eating out of boredom and concerned about overeating. Well, again, this is outside of what would be considered normal. So these people, again, are eating until uncomfortably full. They're eating large amounts of food when not hungry. So abnormal behavior, not like what we would do during a holiday setting, like a birthday party or Thanksgiving. Again, they are having clinical levels of difference during these binge eating episodes, to include eating alone due to embarrassment and feeling shameful and having that depression and that disgust with what they've committed after that binge eating episode.
Hang on, there we go.
And what separates this from bulimia nervosa is that these individuals do not have compensatory behaviors like we would see with bulimia nervosa and the purging. Or Cody, you were asking about another extreme, anorexia nervosa, where someone may now go to a clinical restriction of calories or compulsive behavior to compensate with exercise. In the studies that I saw, I didn't necessarily see that one would lead to the other. However, because of its association with emotions and trying to regulate emotions and dealing with life stressors, I don't think that that's outside of the realm for a person to experience different extremes of these eating disorders when trying to cope with the emotions and interpersonal problems. And we'll go into that stuff a little bit later. So again, with binge eating disorder, it differs from the other eating disorders because there is not such a focus on the compensatory behaviors. And because these individuals aren't engaging in so many compensatory behaviors, some of them may try to diet, some of them may try to exercise, but it's not sustained because that's not the hallmark of binge eating disorder.
And I would add, Cody, with your question, part of the treatment for this, and even if it's not binge eating disorder, if it's someone with some body image stuff, part of it would be monitoring. Is it going to go to an extreme where now there's kind of this secondary issue of there's all this anxiety around eating and when I eat, what I eat, dealing with carbs, fat, and protein. And so that's stuff that I would hope when a clinician is working with somebody who's dealing with this, that they would monitor it, that it's being healthy with it. And that also means being emotionally healthy. And if someone is experiencing a great deal of like anxiety or distress around their food, even though we're seeing a healthier trend with they're eating healthier food and they're exercising better portion control and stuff like that, it shouldn't be at the expense of enjoying their life, enjoying what they're eating and stuff like that. So that's stuff that once they have crossed into that threshold of healthier eating and things like that, we would also keep a pulse on.
So again, what is a big hallmark of this, and I kind of alluded to it earlier, coping for emotional regulation. And when they're doing that, the person is experiencing the binge eating episode and trying to cope with emotion. Therefore, they are disassociated from the act of eating. Okay, so this is as he has here, the red flag. They are using it for a means of escape, and therefore they lack the ability to control or stop. So much so that there are a lot of studies looking at the correlation with ADHD and binge eating disorder. We'll talk about some of those treatments later on and where the future is going. Looking at the impulse and compulsion, as well as some of those pathway issues that this person may be experiencing.
And I'll add on to this that the lack of control, that's, in my opinion, that's the mechanism by which you would say, okay, this isn't just overeating or emotional eating, or even just being like maybe over indulgent, right? Like I have a huge sweet tooth, right? I'll eat whatever candy's put in front of me. It's the I'm unaware of doing it, the feelings of dissociation, and that's sort of where we got the title for this, right? When I'm hurting, I eat, because when I'm eating, I'm now dissociating and I'm not hurting. And we're gonna go into that more a little bit. Katrina, your question about do counselors work with a registered dietitian, it would probably depend on the severity and the setting. You don't need to. However, if there's a lot of metabolic and medical issues, I would suggest making that part of the treatment, especially if they're getting test results or medical results that suggest, hey, you've really got to change some of these patterns, or you're going to have a heart attack. You're at these heightened risks for all the metabolic things like that. So it might be worthwhile to just kind of know in your community, and then it's a reciprocal thing. The registered dietitians know all about the diet and food and things like that, and we ideally would know a lot about healthier ways of managing emotions, because as we'll see when we get to the treatment section, this is very much a disorder that revolves around emotion.
So binge eating disorder is not overeating. These are not people experiencing some kind of moral dilemma and a lack of education and are lacking self-control and don't understand what is healthier patterns of eating, and it's definitely not a lifestyle. As Dr. Leeth mentioned earlier, while there may be some craving for salty, sweet, fat, things of that nature, a lot of that stuff has to do with accessibility, because it's easier to get, it's easier to afford, as well as some of that reward pathway. When we're eating those foods, they do make us feel good when we're eating sweet and salty and fatty foods. And Sonia, you had asked a question about the association with nocturnal and night eating. There is research speaking to that phenomenon as well. And also remember that a lot of these people are having these binge eating episodes when they're able to separate themselves from the view of others And in a lot of instances, we are able to be more isolated outside of normal working hours and at night when we're away from our spouse, when the children are not seeing us and we're out of the eye of being judged and questioned by everyone else around. And so, yes, there are some studies that are looking at that, at the relationship between nocturnal and night eating as well to binge eating disorder.
And it's also that last point about it not being a lifestyle. So we're not talking about maybe feederism or competitive eating. So when I give this lecture in my classes, I get a lot of, well, what about those people that do like the hot dog eating contest and things like that, or the competitive eating? That is an instance where the person's in control of it, right? They're choosing to do that. I want to do that. So again, it's not just the amount of food. It's the lack of control and the dissociation that really makes it a diagnosis. And Melissa, to your question, is there a link between sexual trauma and binge eating? Absolutely, there is, and we're going to get to that towards the end of the presentation.
So actually, I'm discussing a little bit of it right now. About 90% of individuals experiencing binge eating disorders, they do have other psychological comorbidities as well as some physiological comorbidities, yes. Next slide, please, sir.
Oh.
So namely, anxiety and depression are the two biggest psychological comorbidities. However, there are others. Melissa, you were asking about the childhood sexual or sexual trauma in general, and I'm sorry about saying childhood. But what it does share in common with some of the other eating disorders is, yes, a lot of these individuals have experienced historical past trauma, that being sexual abuse, sexual assault, and other life stressors. There is a strong relationship of genetic and epigenetic propensity of individuals having binge eating disorder, if it is in the family, if the parents had an issue with it. And as I mentioned earlier, strong correlation to those lacking proper emotional regulation. And someone here was mentioning some of their own experiences of being uncomfortable and some of the things that they went through with their own experience. And yes, there are high levels of low self-esteem to go along with binge eating disorder.
All right, and so one of the biggest things that individuals, and this is what ties in with one of the major themes with this conference, is stigma, right? And so there is stigma around food, and some of you may understand that, right? This is something that happens a lot. Think of the names that we give food, the comments, are you really going to eat all that? Or, hungry today, things like that. So with disorder comes a lot of shame. And now that's not one of the criterion or anything, but we can expect that to happen. And not everybody that has overweight or obesity has binge eating disorder, but quite a few people with binge eating disorder would have with them overweight or obesity. And obesity has a tremendous amount of shame and stigma with it. And that's for both sexes and across ethnicities and sexual orientation. Because of the shame with the amounts of food, this leads to eating in secret, like Carl had said. So this might be, I'm eating when nobody is home, kind of scheduling my meals. And that's where that 2-hour window really, that criterion kind of falls short, because I might stretch it out. I might eat in secret, hiding food. And that's just like it sounds. It might be that I hide snacks in my closet. I don't want my partner or my roommate to know. And it's not out of a place of, I don't want my college roommate to eat my Pop-Tarts. It's that I don't want people to see the amount or the type of food. Lying about what's being eaten and underreporting. So what does this mean clinically for us? That means when we're asking about food history or eating patterns, we have to engage that client in dialogue. And that's something that would go without saying. Everybody already knows to do that, but it's not sufficient to tell someone, write down on a sheet of paper what you eat and bring it to me. In this case, with binge eating disorder, what you would get is probably an underreporting compared to maybe somebody who's dealing with not eating enough, or someone struggling with anorexia, where they would probably put every detail of what they ate. So with this is something to engage them with, and you're building that rapport, right? That it's okay, I'm not judging you, I want to help you reach your goal, I want you to be happy, and things like that. And so you're going at their pace, you're meeting them where they're at, all that stuff that we learn in counseling school, right? But we can't just say, fill this out, and then we look at it. That's a really prescriptive thing. And we don't want to do that, but also it's an ineffective method. Lots of anxiety over food and eating, right? So just getting nervous, this implicit autonomic process of there's food here, I don't want people to see me eat, which is common across all of the eating disorders and all of the non-clinical body image issues. Sensitivity towards negativity. So this is being hypersensitive to negative feedback, negative emotions, having a bad day. They're already feeling sunburned, right? And so when I touch my arm that's sunburned, what happens? It hurts a lot. So this is someone who if they feel uncomfortable, they feel it a lot. It really affects them. And impaired pathways, neurological pathways, especially with the reward and inhibitory systems, much like in the cases of addiction, right? They get quite a high amount of endorphins when that craving is met, and then lessened inhibitory pathways. There can be impulsive behavior. So what this looks like is I mean to only go drop something off at the UPS store. There is a donut shop right there, so I'm just gonna pop in. So it's impulsivity around food mainly. Low distress tolerance. So if something goes wrong, I have an exam, or I'm late to work, I really have a difficult time managing those feelings and those thoughts. Low emotion regulation, right? Things are either a 0 or a 10, especially when it comes to negative emotions such as sadness or fear. Very intense cravings, and sensitivity towards food cues. So a food cue is, I want you to think, this is a fun little experiment everybody can do. When you're driving wherever you're going today, or even as you're watching TV, note how many commercials and billboards you see for restaurants or food, right? So when I drive from my campus to my house, there's one for Chipotle, there's one for Subway, there's McDonald's and Burger King and Wendy's and all of that. So they notice all of that, and that kind of triggers. And I know trigger is kind of a loaded word because it means different things based on the context, but seeing these images of food and having this opportunity to maybe get food, it starts the system, it starts the process of craving. And sensitivity towards body signals. So this is someone who's really attuned to their body. The issue though is that the person interprets all bodily signals as hunger. So this is something in counseling you'd work with. What does hunger feel like? What does satiety feel like? For this person, a lot of what they feel kind of brings them to a place of wanting to eat. And so that brings us to how do we get here, right? How did we get to this place? And so one theory is escape theory. Some of you might be familiar with this one. And this is the one that I think is probably most prevalent with people with binge eating disorders or binge eating issues, is that I want to get away from the negativity I'm feeling. And when I eat, I get that dissociation. And when I'm dissociated, I don't have to feel anything, right? So I got really insulted at work, or I went to school and I was made fun of. I'm feeling ashamed. I'm feeling bad. I don't like myself. I don't like this feeling. And when I eat, I just sort of check out, right? I'm gone. And it's not that it's making me feel good. I feel nothing, right? And that's really where that fine line is between this and emotional eating, right? Whereas emotional eating, you're eating stuff that makes you feel good. So a comfort food is, I had a bad day. So for me, it's ice cream. I get some ice cream and that elevates my mood, rightfully or wrongfully. And then with this, what happens, the person is just, I'm gone. I get lost in the mechanism of eating, right? So it's the action of eating that gives me the desired effect more so than any specific food. Jennifer, for your question about what happens neurochemically while eating, very much, and I get to this at the very end, very much the same exact thing that happens with substance abuse or with addiction, especially the behavioral addictions, right? So there's no exogenous chemical being introduced into the body. This is, I'm eating and then my body says, you're doing the thing I like, release the feel-good chemicals. And so that's what we get. And someone who does this over and over and over again, the plasticity forms that neural pathway of eating makes me feel better. Sonia, for your question, specific food triggers. So this is a great rabbit hole. I'm on the side that says sugar is addictive. And I'm someone who has a huge sweet tooth. This absolutely happens. The additives, the excitrons, that is a really deep rabbit hole, and I look forward to going down it a little bit more, but that does play a role. Affect regulation. So this, for those of you that practice DBT, this is what we're referring to. I feel bad. I want to make myself feel better. So finding a way to, that someone has found a way to unhealthfully cope with those negative emotions. So they're not regulating their mood or affect very well. For both models, and this is what happens quite a bit with binge eating, that this is not always a conscious decision. And that's, again, the stigma, right? They feel bad for feeling bad. This is to take the pressure off your client with this, that this is an autopilot kind of situation 9 times out of 10. The person feels bad, they're running late to work, or they get some critical feedback. And, you know, we can't control other people. So maybe I just run into someone who's like a real jerk to me, and that makes me feel bad. My immediate reaction is to eat. However, it's not a thought I have at the front of my mind, like, hey, that guy was a jerk to me, I'm gonna go eat to feel better. It's all implicit. It's an autopilot thing. And so when we're working, we kind of have to try and catch that. Similar to what happens with substance abuse and addiction, when someone with, for example, alcohol addiction, they have a rough day, they start thinking, I need a drink, right? Or I want a drink. And we got to try and shift that a little bit. And that's where there's a lot of the work for this. Elizabeth, yeah, passive thoughts. And so that's what happens here. With regulation, the person, again, remember, they're already prone to negativity, or they're really sensitive to things that go wrong. That's why some dysthymia or depression, clinical or non-clinical, tends to hover around this disorder. Everything is kind of gray. When things go wrong, I notice it. And so that kind of keeps feeding this, this implicit regulation, or this implicit mechanism to eat.
And so here we're going to look at what the research is showing has been promising, both short-term and long-term, some fairly decent efficacy, as well as some of the promising pharmaco interventions as well. interpersonal therapy. As we've mentioned throughout the presentation, a lot of these folks are dealing with the emotional regulation and, as Dr. Leeth was just describing, the propensity to be sensitive to some of those life stressors and those conflicts. As we mentioned earlier, a lot of these individuals are dealing with life stressors such as relationship change, similar to other eating disorders, grief, and loss. Also, expectations within relationships, a change in the marriage, and not necessarily divorce, just change. And those relationships. And so there has been high efficacy with the use of interpersonal therapy to help them coping in dealing with those conflicts, to work in curbing some of those symptoms that they experience during the binge eating disorder and those episodes.
CBT, which everybody's familiar with. Here we're focusing on a lot of psychoeducation, right? What are cravings, how to use the food diary, communicating, remember, take caution when using a food diary, but a lot of education about eating, what do the sensations feel like, where does the need for food come from? So a lot of focus on changing any possible of faulty logic or schemas. DBT, and so this is like in full transparency, I lean much more heavily into DBT. Mindfulness, to address what does hunger feel like, helping understand what are you feeling, why do you feel that way, what's making you feel that way, what do you do with that emotion. If your goal is to eat less or to change your diet, how can we work with that? Distress tolerance. So this is, again, if I have a really bad day, I'm gonna go home and I'm just gonna wreck shop, right? I'm gonna go eat everything. Let's find a better way of dealing with that, right? And that dovetails with that emotion regulation, finding balance with, it's normal to crave, right? You should indulge yourself every so often, right? Treat yourself, enjoy life, enjoy that food and everything like that. We just want to do it in a healthy way, in a way where you don't feel shame, and in a way where you don't feel embarrassed and things like that. And most importantly, in a place where you feel in control. Acceptance and commitment therapy, looking at values, right? So we would start with what's important to you. What do you want? Is it relationships? Is it satisfaction at work? Things like that. Diffusing how the person may have connected with the eating, right? So someone who says, well, I just eat, that's what I do, I can't help it, right? Unfortunately, they get sucked into this. And so there's like this fatalistic point of view of nothing can ever change. I've tried this, I've tried that. And so really a lot of time would go into trying to separate, no, you are not this disorder. You are not a binge eater. You're a person, right, that has feelings and thoughts. And there is this behavior that sometimes gets in the way of your goals and things like that. And so we want to separate that. Focusing on the mindfulness, right? Being present moment. So not always dwelling on what has happened. So taking care of any rumination issues and not worrying excessively about the future, and being flexible. So this is psychological flexibility, being able to roll with the punches, being able to handle distress. Group therapy, Cody, I think would be great, especially if you get one really great or two really great clients in there who are confident and say, hey, I'm not this disorder, change is possible, counseling helps, things like that. I absolutely love your comparison to substance abuse. I think you could use a lot of the same strategies and it would work well.
And there have been some research studies showing great efficacy with the use of pharmacotherapy, namely these stimulants. They have been attempting to use some antidepressants, given that there are a lot of psychological comorbidities, even things such as anti-obesity medications, some anorectic medications, but number one so far has been stimulants. And I mentioned earlier some of the relationship between binge eating disorder and ADHD. Well, come to find out that one of these stimulants, lisdexamfetamine, otherwise known as Vyvanse, has shown great success long-term for treating individuals with binge eating disorder. One of the individuals during his interview explained that he couldn't maintain positive relationships. It was hard for him to be at work. It was hard for him to do simple activities like reading because he was constantly finding his mind always going to food. As Dr. Leeth mentioned, some of the anxiety having to do with everything with food and eating, how, what, when. And by using Vyvanse for the treatment of, he found that he got his life back. And long term, even a year after being off of the medication, he said he just felt like a human again.
And so this will be our last slide, and then want to leave a couple minutes for questions. So where do we go with binge eating disorder from here? One of the bleeding edge research and debates in the eating disorder communities about binge eating disorder is it an addictive disorder? So are we talking about a behavioral addiction similar to exercise addiction or sex addiction or gambling addiction? It has many of the same patterns. We see a lot of the same neurobiological traits, the reward and inhibitory systems, the neural pathways changing, and also changing back using a lot of the same strategies that we would when working with someone who has substance abuse or substance addiction issues. And then the really philosophical question is it really, if it is an addiction or an addictive disorder, is it an addiction to food or is it an addiction to eating, right? If it's an addiction to food, then any food should do, but that's not the case. And if it's an addiction to eating, like the mechanism of eating and masticating and chewing and things like that, then can we swap in healthy foods? And we don't see that either. So that's where we're at, trying to figure out what is this about. Individuals with binge eating disorder might have some stigma and shame around obesity and body shape and things like that. But really the prevalent issue that you'd see when working with this person is I have a lot of shame around my eating behavior and what I eat and how much I eat. So Carl, do you have anything you want to add, or do you think it's okay to open it up for questions with the 5 minutes we've got left?
I think it'd be safest to open it up if anyone had some final thoughts, some questions, and we'd go from there.
So Katrina, so with the essentially the starving during the day, then binging at night, that's a fairly common idea. I'll let Carl jump in as comfortable as he is. My 2 cents is that people do that. If they're in control and they're choosing to do that, then it might be kind of more education that we focus on in terms of, hey, what are we going for? Maybe focusing on indulging and things like that versus restraint. For someone who has purged so much that food's coming up automatically after eating, yeah, then that's someone who's really cemented in there. Those symptoms have really settled in. I would suggest medication or medical, get some medical consultation and things like that. Some mindfulness on our end, and then seeing if there are certain types of food that a registered dietitian or a physician would suggest. Carl, is there anything that you wanted to add to Katrina's question?
No, and I'm tying into that. Other folks are asking about intermittent fasting and introducing that to clients. I think you hit the nail on the head earlier, sir, when you were just talking about some education does help, but I think it should be used with other psychological therapies to address those concerns.
Let's see, Sonia, for your question, there's about this, right now, women, it's been reported that women are twice as likely to have binge eating disorder than men. But I, again, would take that statistic with a grain of salt, as women typically go to counseling more often. I think what we'll see is that this is going to flatten out, and we would actually see a similar ratio between men and women. So a 1-to-1 ratio. For intuitive eating, Carrie?
Really quick, sir. Pardon me, Dr. Leeth. Something that I did find in the research, it did say, again, I didn't see it across all the research that I saw, but as far as the differences between men and women, that binge eating disorder happened to be the most prevalent eating disorder for men.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yes.
Good. Thank you, Carl. Intuitive eating, I think that has a place as well. Absolutely important. It would fit nicely in with any sort of mindfulness practice. So if you're doing DBT or even a CBT and being mindful how to eat, listen to your body, knowing the difference between craving and hunger, that would be appropriate. Intermittent fasting, I don't know. I have to think about that one, because the goal is we want the binges to be smaller. I don't want to set up a situation where a person feels like, well, as long as I don't eat for these 16 hours, then for the next 8 hours, I can do whatever I want. So I would just be, introduce it when they're in a good, solid place of recovery. And that might be a good long-term strategy for them after the initial treatment endeavors.
Dr. Leeth, we had a question from Watkins, was asking, were there some suggested readings that you could think of?
Very good. I have some articles. If you send Carl or I an email, I'll be happy to forward them to you, because I'm blanking on the title right now. But I have some great readings. I'm happy to share them. Let's see, on how to approach and reduce shame. Letting them know that they're a person, right? You're a person, you hurt, you crave, you're allowed to eat, and that's okay. You are not this disorder. And you're not damaged, you're not broken. We just got to help you find some ways of managing this and working through that. So a lot of your standard stuff, I would just expect a lot of the shame to be around my food. I look bad, I feel bad, and just saying, hey, this is not, I get that, validate and push for change.
And Robin, to piggyback on that, as practitioners, when we're speaking to our clients, we want to make sure that we're using appropriate language. So try not to use language that would further stigmatize and ostracize these individuals. So if we want to broach the subject, if we have concern that there may be experiencing binge eating disorder, just start with that DSM criterion. And you could start with the first one. Do you ever feel like you are eating more than what would be considered normal under similar circumstances? And go from there. Similar questions. Do you find that you are eating after you are full to the point of being uncomfortable? And then depending on what the client says, we go from there. If they say no, then drop it.
Let's see, and then, very good, Carl. Reduce shame. So what are good tools to deal with the emotional issues? One, finding what is causing or what's feeding into the emotional problems? Where did they come from? That standard, when did this start? Did you ever not feel this way? And then I lean towards DBT, so take it with a grain of salt, but using those methods of helping regulate emotions. And then Tim, is it nature or nurture? This is going to sound like a cop-out answer, but it's both, right? So it can be, you can have someone who's a highly sensitive person, right? And so that would feed into it. Plus, mom and dad, when I have a rough day, they're always giving me cake and cookies and things like that. And then that starts feeding into it. I learned that eating is the way to feel better. Robin, thank you so much for sharing. I've reclined. All right, I think that's going to do it for us. We're right at about 2 o'clock. Both of our emails are there. Feel free to contact us, and we will work with the coordinators and get this presentation to them so everybody can have it. And thank you so much for attending, and thanks for your wonderful questions and comments.
Thank you both very much. The presentation will also be available as a video on our school's YouTube channel.
Oh, wonderful. Excellent. Thank you.
You're welcome.